I want to continue where we left off and just say just one quick word about the function of law. It is not the law to make us better. It is not the function of the law to justify us if we are not righteous. The law can only declare what the law finds. And it is for that reason that justification cannot come by the law, because the law cannot remedy our problem. The only thing the law can do is declare what it finds to be true about us. It is for this reason that Paul wrote that righteousness does not come by the law. It is not that a righteous status before God has nothing to do with law. Righteousness cannot be understood in anything other than in legal terms, because it is a legal matter. It is not a term that belongs in the operating room. It's a term that belongs in the courtroom. Now, the second issue I want to deal with, which is closely related to that issue, is the question, how is justification to be defined according to its biblical usage? And I just want to use maybe 3 verses to see how this term justify or justified or justification can be used. In the current debate, it is important that we understand how the biblical writers use this term. The phrase Mr. Dohse continues to ignore in Mr. Goldworthy's statement is the ground of justification. Mr. Goldworthy was not saying that believers have no righteousness whatsoever that is inworked by the work of the Spirit of God within them. What Mr. Goldworthy is saying is the basis of justification cannot in any sense be that righteousness. The basis of justification can only be the righteousness of Christ, because only that righteousness will stand approved in the presence of God. Now, let's just ask the question. How do the biblical writers use the term justification? Let me give you as an example, Proverbs 17:15. There the writer says, "He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord." He who justifies the wicked, he who condemns the righteous, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord. Now, for the sake of argument, let's just imagine for a moment that the word justifies in that text means an internal alteration of character. Let's try to read the verse and understand the verse in that sense. Then let's try to make some sense of the verse using that sense. It is impossible to do so. If a judge had the ability to actually alter a person's internal character and make him righteous, that judge would not be an abomination to the Lord at all, but would be worthy of the highest praise. Imagine a judge being able to take a criminal who had a long rap sheet and change him internally so that that person no longer wanted to go out and commit crimes. What a wonderful judge that judge would be. But that's not what the verse is talking about. The verse is talking about a judge that looks on a man he knows to be guilty and declares him to be righteous. And he's talking about a judge who looks on a person he knows to be innocent and declares him to be guilty. The wise man says that kind of person is an abomination to the Lord. And so he's using the term to refer to a declaration of righteousness that either does or does not conform to reality. It's simply a declaration that something is true. Let me give you an example. I watched very intently years ago as O.J. Simpson, one of my favorite football stars, was on trial for his life because he had been accused of committing a heinous crime. And the jury heard the evidence, the judge heard the evidence, the jury went out, came back in, and this was their verdict. Their verdict was, we find Orenthal Simpson to be innocent. Now, was that true or was it not true? Perhaps we will never know. But the reality is, based on what they perceived as being the legal standard in that courtroom, they declared him to be innocent of the charges. Did that make him innocent? Not even close. But it was a legal declaration of his innocence. And given U.S. law, he was just as innocent in the eyes of the law as if he had never committed any crime whatsoever. That's what justification means. Consider Luke chapter 7, verse 29, where we are told that even the tax collectors justified God. And then Romans chapter 3 and verse 4, quoting Psalm 51 and verse 4, about God, that you may be justified in your words, that you may be justified. Now, the question is, can we make God righteous? And the answer is, of course not. Why can't we make God righteous? Because God is righteous already. And so why does the writer say, even the tax collectors justified God? What does that mean? Does it mean they made God more righteous than he was? Of course not. What it means is they declared God to be righteous. And that's the way the word is used throughout the scriptures. Number 3. What does Paul mean by the term without the law in Romans chapter 3 and verse 21? Mr. Dohse believes the teaching of this verse should end the debate altogether, since Paul has stated that justification is, quote, apart from law. He believes that not only are the sinner's acts of obedience to the law excluded by these words, but obedience performed by anyone, including Christ, is excluded as the basis of justification, because justification has to be, according to him, apart from the law. And hence the basis of the believer's justification before God cannot be the imputed righteousness of Christ and his obedience to the law of God under which he was born. Now, as we've seen, it's impossible for us to even talk about justification apart from law, since justification is a judicial term. It is a term that belongs in the courtroom. Righteousness, whether imputed or personal, involves conformity to a standard. And in this case, that standard is the universal and perpetual law of God. Justification is apart from the works of the law, not because justification has nothing to do with law, but because no one in the human family apart from Christ possesses a justifiable righteousness when judged by God's law. The sinner's justification has to be apart from personal obedience to the law, because the sinner's best obedience fails to measure up to that standard. To be justified apart from law, or apart from the works of the law, is to be justified without anything in ourselves to merit justification according to God's law. It does not mean that it is apart from law as far as Christ was concerned. Otherwise, that he was born under the law that he might redeem those that are under the law is without significance altogether. What the law cannot do is declare a person who is born in sin and lives habitually in rebellion against God and in disobedience to his revealed will, and who has no heart to please God, it cannot declare that person to be righteous. And therefore, righteousness must be apart from the law. What the law cannot do is declare a person righteous who is born. What the law can do is declare a person righteous who is born apart from sin and who lives perfectly, continually, and inwardly in conformity to its demands. If such a person is presented before the law, then the law can justify him. The law can declare him righteous. Now, having said that, I want to consider what Paul says and what he was actually saying in Romans chapter 3 and verse 21 when he says, "But now, apart from the law, God's righteousness is revealed." being witnessed by the law and the prophets. What does Paul mean by that? The words nunide, translated but now, draw a contrast between two eras. The old era of sin's dominion, that resulted in the sinner's condemnation under the law, and the new era of the reign of grace. God's wrath dominated the old, God's righteousness dominates the new. The contrast is not between justification by law and justification apart from law, but what Paul is showing is that justification has always been apart from law. No one has ever been justified by the law, because the law's demands are far too high for anyone to be justified. In chapter 4 of Romans, Paul has said, "What shall we say that Abraham, our father, as concerning the flesh, has found? For if Abraham were justified by works, he has whereof to glory, but not before God." What did Abraham find? And in that context, Paul says, "Unto him who works, the reward is not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But unto him who does not work, but believes in him," and listen to this phrase, believes in him who justifies the ungodly. This is what Abraham found. This is what Abraham found. Unto him who believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Now, the contrast in Romans chapter 3 and verse 21 is not about justification or how it's accomplished and applied at all. In reality, the contrast that Paul is drawing there is not between how justification is received, but instead he's talking about how that righteousness of God has been manifested. Is it most clearly manifested in the law, or is it most clearly manifested in the gospel? And when he talks about the righteousness of God in this context, he's using the term dikaisune theou in the same way that he uses these words in the rest of the book of Romans. He is talking about God's method of putting sinners right with himself according to his covenant faithfulness. This is what Paul means when he uses the term the righteousness of God. How is that method of God most clearly displayed? Is it most clearly displayed by the law, or is it most clearly displayed in the gospel? And Paul's answer, of course, is that law, that method of God in justifying sinners is most clearly displayed in the gospel. The phrase, the gospel of God, is talking about God's revelation of his prescription for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Throughout the Old Testament scriptures, we find a witness to that method of justification, but now it has been resplendently displayed in the work of Jesus Christ and in the manifestation of God's glory in Christ's redemptive work. That method was never before revealed in the way that it has now been fully revealed in the gospel. Paul is not teaching that justification has no relationship to God's law whatsoever, but that the gospel has revealed God's salvific method in a way the law never could. That's the whole issue in Romans chapter 3. Well, next time we're going to take up where we left off, and we're going to talk about the rest of these issues, and then of course we'll give Mr. Dohse an opportunity to respond, and we'll see if there are questions and answers, and see if there is rebuttal. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. Until next time, may God